Hi, I'm Wes, the Explosion, and this is the Backlog. This week I played Tunche by Leap Game Studios on the Switch. It's a roguelite beat-em-up where a group of kids head into the Amazon rainforest to find Tunche, a creature, demon thing that might kill them or grant them a wish. They seem slightly hazy on the details. I'm not going to mince words here. This game is grindy as heck. It gives Dragon Quest a run for its money. I kind of sensed something was amiss when I started the gameplay and my moveset was very limited. I had one basic combo that was just me using the attack button 3 times, one projectile that required magic, I could jump and dash, and hit enemies into the air to do another 3-press aerial. My misgivings were further solidified when my first whole run was an alternating pattern of fights and explanations, them telling me about the game's 3 currency systems, how shops and bonus games work, about the medallions I could collect in a run to gain buffs, the style meter, and how I could buff my character back at camp, which I got further explanations of when I died. I'd expect something like this from an RPG, but when I'm ready to go into an action title, it feels a lot more tedious. And speaking of tedious, then there's the actual combat. It consists of just kind of hitting the enemies over and over again, with very little variety in what you're fighting or what you can do, especially early on. All the enemies feel a bit harder than you'd expect, and each stage is a lot longer than it needs to be. Even beyond that, the fights are kind of annoying. As typical with these games, positioning is really important. You needing to either keep all of your foes on one side of you, or far enough away so that you don't get sucker punched from behind. But because of the random element, sometimes new enemies will spawn in, sometimes you'll get rushed by exploding enemies, and sometimes monkeys will pop down and throw poo at you, which, depending on how close they came in at, you might not even have time to dodge. All of this happens with seemingly no rhyme or reason, sometimes happening at the end of one wave, sometimes when you're partway through another, and sometimes when nothing has changed for several seconds. Then, when you face the boss, it has 2 health bars. One you need to take out to stagger them, then you can do actual damage to their real HP count, and after so long, they'll get back up and their first bar gets refilled. There are a few ways to mitigate this. During runs, you collect coins that expire on death, but while you got them, if you come across the shop, you can use them to buy either healing or specific medallions that you found on previous runs. If you gain enough XP, you can then buy the chance for a safe zone to spawn in specific levels on subsequent runs. Most important of all, though, is the essence you can collect to fill out your skill tree and buff the effects you get from the medallions if you find the upgraded one again. With the skill tree, you can fill out your moveset, raise the effectiveness of healing, and how many potions you can carry, and, once you clear a boss, you can even increase your damage output and how much HP and magic you have. Sounds great, doesn't it? And it probably should have been, but remember when I called this game a grind? I wasn't just talking about stage length and how much of early combat consists of just hitting the same button countless times. No, the game is super stingy with the currency you need to get yourself even the most basic improvements. You might be able to afford something small after one run, and the nicer stuff might take a few. And while each of these do make the game a bit more bearable, I don't think that even after hours of playing, I would say that things became super dynamic. I was still fighting the same 4 or 5 enemies, switching from the basic combo I started with to one that was a bit more effective. If I wanted more variety though, there were 5 characters. I originally picked up the game because it had Hat Kid from A Hat in Time as a guest, so she was the one I started playing with. But all the others look cute and interesting too, so I would have loved to switch things up. One problem though. Each character has their own skill tree, and while you share currency, you do not share unlocks, so that would mean building someone from the ground up. Given that it took hours just to build Hat Kid into something resembling playable, there was no way I was starting from scratch with another character that might have not have even suited my playstyle. The game is also multiplayer, up to 4-player co-op. I did not get a chance to try this myself, though I almost suckered one person into it. I did look up some articles and gameplay vids though, and the general opinion seems to be that this is the more fun way to play. And based off of the video I saw, it doesn't seem to really balance things based off of how big your team is. At first I thought that maybe damage was lessened, but going back over what numbers I was dishing out, I seemed to be mistaken. I probably should have figured that this wasn't taken into consideration when the game dropped an ability for me that would have only benefited multiplayer. Given that your damage output would be increased and crowd control easier to manage, playing single seems to be the de facto hard mode. And while you can kinda spoof things on PC, with consoles, Online co-op is not available, so unless you know someone you can get to do couch co-op with, you're pretty much stuck with the less than ideal single player. Then again, if you were to form a party, you'd have to share resources, so maybe that was their way of balancing things. Though that's kind of a crappy method if you ask me. So now I'm gonna ask a favor of you. Please look at what is going on screen. Look real carefully and please tell me honestly. Does any of this look fun or interesting? Does any of this look like the sort of thing that you would want to play? Because I love Hat Kid. I love beat 'em ups. I love the art style. I love indie games, especially from countries that we don't typically get games from. I normally even like building up characters, and yet I was miserable playing this game. There's a lot that could be done to salvage this. The big thing would be just making it not such a chore to build out the skill tree, either by making drops more generous, branches cost less, or both. Even besides that though, there's a bunch of other little tweaks that could have made this more tolerable. Shorter levels, online co-op, more moves unlocked at the start, less random bullcrap interrupting the stun lock that you carefully corralled a group of enemies into. Instead, it feels like they took an hour-long game and did everything they could to drag it out so that it would take most players 10 to 15 hours to clear. When I eventually decided I was done with the game, I realized that I had to do one more run to get the video of it. I booted it back up and actually had a pretty good run of things, causing me to not have fun but at least find it tolerable. I finally managed to get to the second boss without a lot of health, but I figured I could at least feel them out and decide whether I was willing to give the game maybe a few more chances when this happened. Honestly, with how dead set the game seemed to be against me making any kind of progress, I don't even consider this a bug, just a feature. In case it's not obvious, I would advise against this title. And in keeping with the past few weeks, I tackled another Castlevania, this time Castlevania 3, Dracula's Curse. This time you play as Trevor Belmont, an ancestor to Simon, among others, and again, or is it for the first time, we need to kill Dracula. This one is more in line with the first title, you traveling through a linear level to reach a boss, you being able to power up your whip and find different secondary weapons to swap between that can be used by consuming hearts. I was once again lusting after an instruction booklet as I got to what sets this game apart from the other 3 titles I played, and that was split paths and character recruitment. After the first level, I came to a screen where I could either choose an upper or lower path. Being unfamiliar with this title, I wasn't sure what exactly this meant, but my educated guess was that there were multiple ways to get through the game, and either each route would take me to a different ending, or they would all loop back together again, just varying the exact set of levels I had to tackle. I found myself climbing a tower filled with cogs and gears. When I reached the top, I felled a boss, and rather than dropping an orb, like other bosses, it instead turned into a guy who said he had been possessed, and Dracula had killed his parents, and so he asked if he could come with me. This was another instance of me not knowing the consequences of something, thinking that maybe it would help me, maybe he would betray me eventually, or maybe it would turn into an escort mission. Despite a lot of those probably being too advanced for an NES game, due to my cynical nature, I turned him down and we parted ways, him saying that he hoped we would meet again. I then needed to walk back down the tower, which was kinda funny, kind of annoying, and at the bottom, rather than fighting another boss, perhaps one that would drop an item that I required, instead, Trevor just jauntily waltzed out the front door while a jingle played. Then I went to the other stage that I had passed on the first time. I looked up a playthrough since I was so baffled, and it seems that if I had said yes to the guy at the top, he would have joined my party and I could have swapped between him and Trevor. It made me immediately think of the more pixely spin-off of Bloodstained, and it became really obvious where the inspiration, or since a lot of the same people worked on both, experience came from. Later I fought a vampire that seemed way too early to be Dracula, and after the fight, they introduced themselves as Alucard, giving me the same option as before, and this time I said yes to let him join me. Alucard was taller than Trevor and could huck energy balls as an attack that went further but were a bit weaker. I didn't realize it right away, but the party also shared a health bar, so there's no way to fill out your roster to prolong your lifespan. So pretty much I never used Alucard. Soon after that, I reached Dracula's castle, and everything became fully linear again. A level or two into this is where I stopped having fun. Up to that point, the game was tricky but doable. Castlevania and I were having a nice time with what felt like a comfortable back and forth of friendly teasing and light roughhousing. And then things got just kind of unreasonable. Sections just started getting really drawn out, my first inkling that things had taken a turn being at the second falling block obstacle. You refight a pretty simple earlier boss with a slightly trickier room, and then you're dropped into the section immediately afterwards, you likely getting hit with the first block in the time it takes you to figure out what's going on unless you've done this before. The blocks fall in a set pattern, only switching tracks once, so it's easy to predict, but it just goes on for so long. You need the blocks to stack high enough for you to reach the upper ledge, which should have been a 30 to 60 second section, but instead it was drawn out to between 3 and 5 minutes, unless my need to reload it multiple times warped my sense of time, which gives a lot of chances to make mistakes. Things didn't get any better after that. Some enemies would constantly spawn in, others would camp the top of stairs, making it difficult to advance, so you'd either need to figure out a way to manipulate their walk cycle, find the perfect chance to ascend and attack, or just tank the hit. There's also a lot of tricky platforming sections where you really can't stop moving forward, where enemies will just float in directly into your path. The game is just very unforgiving and mean. That said, it would have been doable if not for the biggest issue with the game, just how poorly the Belmonts control. Trevor moves really slowly, from his walk cycle to how fast his attacks come out. When he gets hit, he flies back as if a car struck him rather than just a bat or shuffling undead. He has 2 jumps, straight up and forwards, and you're locked in when you use it, no tilting the controls to affect where he lands. He also seems to be weak to stairs. The only way you can interact with them is by pressing up or down at the end of them. If you try to land on a set, you just fall right through. If you want to attack while on a case, you need to awkwardly stop, pause, and then strike, so you're almost helpless mid-climb. All but the last of these shortcomings were especially obvious when I had to fight a doppelganger that moved the same way, only he didn't take touch damage, he hit harder, and he wouldn't misjudge jumps being a computer, making him a nightmare to outmaneuver, though admittedly he was one of the easier Drac stage bosses. Simon played the same way, so I'm worried about Castlevania going forward. In the original Castlevania and in the first half of this one, I just kinda took the stiff controls to be part of the challenge and the sort of thing that additional practice would make more manageable. But after late game of this title, I think I just kinda have to admit that I hate how the Belmonts handle. If you took the same game, but just replace who you played as with Mega Man, Mario, or Shovel Knight with their standard methods of offense, I think this would be a blast. Instead, it feels like you're playing through the game with some sort of handicap or status effect. There is no way I would have finished this game if it wasn't for save states. If we count Kid Dracula, this is the 4th Castlevania title that I've played, and I've kind of only enjoyed 1.5 of them. They were all for the NES though, which might have something to do with it. Due to the hardware limitations and a transition from arcades, which were designed to milk quarters from you, to consoles, the system does have a reputation for having really hard games, so I'm hoping that Castlevania starts getting a little more reasonable from here on out. I'm a little worried though, because I've been given the impression that the GBA DS era are where most of the people started getting into them. That's one more game down, taking us to 109 for the list, 108.5 if you consider that I finished with 4 out of the 8 games in the Castlevania collection. I should have another one of those down next week, and I'm probably one stream away from finishing the Neptunia and Senran Kagura crossover, so I'll have plenty to talk about next episode. For right now though, thanks for watching, maybe subscribe if you enjoy this sort of thing, and perhaps I'll see you in episode 73.